Hello everyone, this is Duan. This week I would like to talk about the cooperative asynchronous JavaScript, specifically the SetTimeout, SetInterval, and RequestAnimationFrame APIs. We're going to talk about what they are, where they're used, and what are some of the things that you need to watch out for. So let's get started. So let's start by talking about the SetTimeout method. The SetTimeout method takes in a callback and the amount of delay in milliseconds. So this is generally used for a single delayed operation and also returns an identifier that can be used to clear the timeout using the clear timeout function. It's very important to understand that the timing for the set timeout is dependent on the call stack availability. When your call stack is not empty, even if the delay is 0, it will spend more than 0 seconds to run the callback function. This is because the set timeout only runs when the call stack is empty, so watch out for that. There's another pattern that instead of running the set timeout one time, you can use the set timeout to run a repeated operation. This format is called the recursive timeout. Basically, you're calling the timeout inside of another timeout. So you're scheduling your next timeout after the first function is being called. And it's very useful to guarantee the delay between each call. Next, we have the SetInterval API. So this is generally used for repeated operation. It's very similar to the SetTimeout API, except that the callback is executed every interval. We also have the callback as a first argument, and the second argument, we specify the interval instead of delay. So it's also important to know that the time interval between each callback execution is not guaranteed. This is because the time interval actually starts when the callback function starts, not when the callback function finishes. So if your callback function needs a couple seconds to run, if your interval is less than a second, the next function call might start before your first function finishes. If you want to guarantee a certain delay after the first function, we have mentioned about recursive set timeout, and you can use that to solve this problem. And another thing to watch out for is that the browser will automatically enforce a 4 milliseconds minimum value for the interval. This is after the force operation. For example, if you're running a specific callback for 10 times, after the fourth time, the browser will make sure that the interval will only be run at a minimum of 4 milliseconds to minimize the performance impact of the callback to your application. And the last one we're going to talk about is the RequestAnimationFrame. As you can see from the name, it's usually used for animation purposes. Similar to SetInterval, this is also used for repeated operations, but it actually runs on a frame-to-frame basis. For this API, it does not need a time interval to be specified or the time delay. It runs the callback each frame at the current browser condition. If you have a function that performs an animation on the browser, and the request animation frame allows you to run that function every frame to ensure that your animation is as smoothly as possible when it's being displayed. The downside to this method is that you cannot select a specific frame rate. So if your animation has only a couple of frames, so for example 6 frames, you might not want to use the request animation frame because by default it runs about 60 times a second, so that's 60 frames per second. If you're using a frame rate that's much less than that, your animation is going to look very fast, and instead it's recommended to use a nested set timeout to perform those animations. Okay, so there are other considerations I do want to mention when using the cooperative asynchronous JavaScript. So the SetTimeout and SetInterval API relies on real time. So it is not actually recommended for testing purposes. I believe there are specific timeout methods that you can use for the testing libraries. Try not to use SetTimeout and SetInterval for testing. And secondly, it is best practice to clear the SetTimeout and SetInterval APIs when they're not needed. This is to save the resources and the memory usage by your application. So aside from the callback resource that's being spent, the variables that exist outside of your callback functions that is being used inside of your callback functions are actually not getting garbage collected. They do use up your memories. So just make sure that whenever you don't need those functions to be called, make sure to clear them to save memory usage and the resources. And lastly, I do want to talk about that the SetTimeout and SetInterval API are available for workers. So you can use workers execution context and use those APIs inside of your workers to do some interesting things. But the request animation frame is not available for workers, and it doesn't need to be because you don't perform animations on your workers. Okay, so that's a quick introduction to the cooperative asynchronous JavaScript. I hope you enjoy this video. If you like this video and would like to see more related content, be sure to like and subscribe. I hope to see you in the next video. Bye bye.